Well, good morning. Thank you very much for joining me in this video. You know, we're in an interesting market right now. It's in a market in transition. We're seeing agents using 244s less frequently, more often asking for a 24, 48-hour irrevocable. We're seeing offers that are coming in at or below asking price. We're seeing multiple offers, but fewer of them. And so everybody's confused, not sure what to do. And we're saying, well, is it because of the latest lockdown in COVID? Is that what slowed the market down a bit? We haven't really seen a softening of price, but is that coming? And if realtors who are in the business and doing it on a daily basis are a little bit confused about where the market's going, imagine what the general public is feeling. Imagine what buyers and sellers are facing when they're trying to decide what to do in any given situation. And anytime you've got a market in flux, anytime you got uncertainties in the marketplace, you get buyers and sellers who are prone to change their mind. Buyers who the next morning regret the decision they make. They get cold feet, or sellers who feel like maybe they gave the property away. They should have held out for a higher price. And of course, anytime that happens, you've got buyers or sellers trying to get out of a deal. And we're seeing that more than we've seen it in years. Buyers or sellers wanting to get out of the deal. The buyer's afraid that he's overpaid because there weren't as many offers as he anticipated, or the seller feeling like he talked to his neighbor and he should have got $100,000 over asking and he didn't, and maybe he gave his property away. And so they come up with creative ways to try and get out of the deal. Certainly in the case of a condition, let's say it's conditional on a building inspection, but it was finding it to my satisfaction, out of my sole and absolute discretion. So it's easy for me to find some flaws and walk away. Conditional on financing, but I couldn't get my financing. I couldn't get it that was acceptable to me. But you see, many of these offers came in unconditional because they were in competition, and so they don't have the condition to fall back on. And so maybe they look at the deposit and they say, well, I just won't bring in the deposit, or I'll retract the deposit, something, and that may get me out of the deal. Or they'll imagine some kind of an injustice. Well, I wasn't told this, or I was told that, or the agent didn't, or whatever they can do to try and get out of the deal. And we're running across this. So the question is, can they get out of the deal? Well, it's not always as clear-cut as it might seem. Take the situation of a condition in the offer. Although, like we said with the conditional on building inspection, at their sole and absolute discretion, pretty well gives them a carte blanche to treat it as an option to purchase rather than an offer to purchase. But what if they don't get a building inspection? Then obviously they weren't bargaining in good faith. What about if it's conditional on financing and they say they can't get their financing, but a week later they buy a property at a more expensive figure than the one that they had the offer in on? And so we can challenge whether or not they're walking away in good faith. What about if they didn't bring in a deposit? Well, the deposit doesn't nullify the transaction. The agreement of purchase and sale becomes firm and binding when both parties sign it. Now, one of the first obligations of the buyer is to tender a deposit. If he doesn't do that, it doesn't nullify the deposit. I mean, he means he's in breach of the agreement. So that's the legal part of it. But then there's the practical part of it. And the practical part of it is, how do we rectify the wrong? How do we enforce the completion of the transaction? What do? We had a situation where the seller decided that he'd undersold his property. He got talking to a friend of his and said, oh, you should have got way more than that. You should have held up for more money. So he just arbitrarily refused to close. Came time for closing, he didn't close. Well, the buyer decided he wanted that property. He's going to take legal action. So he commenced legal action against the seller. After 2 or 3 months, the seller relented and sold the property. But see, the buyer didn't pay the full price now because he said, I'm out of pocket all this extra time that I've had to have my property. I've had to do these moving rearrangements and so on. And so he shorted the purchase price. And then the seller just said, well, I'm not going to pay the commission. So now the agent has to get into the courts, get involved in litigation. It's in litigation at the present time. That's because somebody changed their mind. We had a buyer of a triplex, and on the listing it said it was a legal duplex and it had a third apartment. It was clear that it was a legal duplex and an illegal triplex. The buyer, through his agent, put in an offer, and the offer just said residential on its present use. Prior to closing, it was an unconditional offer. Prior to closing, the agent for the buyer said, would you redo the listing on the board and take out duplex or multifamily and put in a single family residence. Obviously, he wanted to do something with the mortgage and he couldn't get it when it was multifamily. Well, the agent wasn't prepared to do that. He felt that that was mortgage fraud, so he wasn't going to do it. So the buyer said, fine, I'm not going to close. Then he said, I want my deposit back. Well, why in the world would he get his deposit back when he went unconditionally and there was nothing misleading at all in the listing? But here's what happened. The buyer, through his agent, said, this is a legal duplex, it's an illegal triplex, and if you don't give the deposit back, we're going to put a formal complaint to the city. The city is reactive. They have to follow up on complaints, and they're going to shut one of his units down. So the seller said, give them their deposit back. Wasn't legal, wasn't right, but a practical point of view, the seller said, I'd rather keep my triplex than limp along with a duplex to keep the deposit. So then we had one where the buyer came in unconditionally, but the seller, it turned out, was an agent. The buyer came in unconditionally, but then had a problem with their financing. So they wanted to walk away from the deal, or at least make it conditional on financing. It turned out that the seller was a registrant, was a real estate agent, hadn't disclosed that, hadn't declared it. So now the buyer was in a position where they could say, well, listen, if you don't let me out of this deal, or at least make it conditional on financing, I'll leave this up to RICO. It doesn't nullify the agreement of purchase and sale, but it puts us in a situation where the agent seller didn't want to face RICO. When RICO investigates an agent where they're a participant in the transaction, the first thing they want is that disclosure statement. And so from a legal point of view, it didn't give the right to nullify these agreements I gave example to, but in a practical case, maybe it did. So if you get caught in one of these situations where a buyer or a seller after the fact is getting cold feet and beginning to change their mind, how should you proceed? Well, the first thing you need to do, and this is very important, is keep your client informed. Whether you're on the buyer side or whether you're on the seller side, make sure right at the get-go that your client knows. Now, I understand the deposit doesn't come in the next day, doesn't come in the day after when it should, and you hate to get your seller alarmed and you feel like, well, they're dragging their feet a little bit, but it's going to come in tomorrow, it's going to come in the next day. But let the client seller participate in that drama. Let them know what's happening and keep them fully informed. The second thing you need to do is take your client, you know this, take your client and try and get them to revisit what led them to the decision in the first place. What was it about the house that you fell in love with it? What was it about the house that you wanted? Now you're in a position that you can buy it. I've seen clients who wanted to walk away. The seller let them walk away. They entered into another agreement, and then the original buyer came back and offered extra money if there's some way to get that house back. You got to cause your client to revisit what led them to that decision. Then the third thing is get the client who's wanting out of the deal, if it's your client, to talk to their lawyer. Now, it depends an awful lot on the stance the lawyer takes. Some lawyers will take the position, you can get out of a deal, it's only a day or two, there's no real damages, let's walk away. Other lawyers will say, look, you signed the agreement, it's a binding agreement, you need to go ahead and close, or they will sue you, and if you don't want the property, you always put it back on the market. It depends on the lawyer, but you need to go through that stance. But the most important thing in any of this is to sit down with your client who's impacted and go over with them the consequences involved as you try and step by step fix the thing as best you can and help the client make an informed decision as to whether he should proceed, even if it means going to the courts, or whether he should just lick his wounds and walk away. I hope that makes sense. Hopefully we don't run into too many of these, but it will happen, and we need to be prepared so that the last thing we want if a deal goes south is it's because of some fault or action of the agent. Hope that makes sense. Thank you very much for taking the time. I'll talk to you again very soon.